Welcome to this sixth in a series of studies of how Mark, the gospel writer, has shaped the story of Jesus in order to apply it to an emergency that was taking place in his church about the year 70, and also in response to the crisis of Judaism that had occurred as a result of the Romans destroying the temple, sacking Jerusalem, and leaving so much of Judaism in shreds. It was more serious, actually, than the emergency in which we find ourselves right now in connection with the international health situation, but an emergency is still an emergency. The central figure in the Gospel of Mark is Jesus, whom Mark presents as speaking not only to the people in the narrative of the gospel, but speaking outside that narrative to the people who were reading the gospel on the assumption that the risen Jesus was still in the world, inviting and asking, offering and extending in the same way that he is pictured doing in the gospel. And it is such an easy step to go from hearing Jesus speaking to the people in the year 70 to hearing Jesus speaking to us in our own situation. One quick reminder that in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is God's agent in the transformation of the world from its present broken, idolatrous, grieving, hard state toward a world that is centered in a living God and in which people live together in mutual support, giving to one another the same kind of love that God gives to us. After Jesus is immersed and confronts Satan in the wilderness and announces this theme as the big theme of his ministry, he calls his first disciples. And this text is found in Mark 1:16-20, where it says that Jesus is passing alongside the Sea of Galilee, which, I remind you again, is not just a geographical reference to a body of water, but is a deep image that evokes the sense of chaos that people in antiquity associated often with water. And the Galilee part reminds us that Jesus was beginning his ministry in an area that was populated approximately 50-50 by Jews and Gentiles, which means that his message is both familiar to Jews and unfamiliar to Gentiles. It is intended, in fact, to help these two communities become one community of mutual support in moving toward the realm of God. He sees Simon, whom we know elsewhere as Peter, and still elsewhere as Cephas. He sees Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the sea, and Mark says they fished. That was their vocation. As the act of fishing, we should not picture someone with a rod and reel on the edge of a bank or in a bass boat, but picture someone in a boat with a net. Perhaps if they're in a boat, then the net is extending to another boat, and they drop the net down into the water, and they bring the two ends of the net together, and then they pull up the fish, take them to shore, and sort them. It was what we would think of as a middle-class occupation, a detail that comes up in a reinforced way later. The act of fishing was, of course, just a part of the everyday economy in the ancient world, but with respect to something that comes up implicitly later, it has a kind of double reference. On the one hand, it is a job in the everyday economy that supplies people with something they need, protein. Yet that everyday economy, from the standpoint of Mark and many people who lived at his time, was an exploitative economy linked in a way to the Roman Empire that drained resources from the people that they could have used for their own communities and siphoned a good many of those, especially financial resources, off to support the Roman Empire, which meant paying for the soldiers who occupied and taxed people in the land. It was a way of paying for their own oppression. Now, Jesus says to them, "Follow me," meaning not only come after me physically, as the original Peter did, but come after me in the time of Mark in the year 70, doing the same things that I did, announcing this great transformation, teaching its way, embodying it in acts of healing and provision, and embodying it through relationships with others that demonstrate the kind of community toward which God is moving us for the end of time. And particularly noteworthy here is the idea, "Follow me and I will make you fish for people." The image of fishing as a way of speaking about a messenger of God comes from the prophet Jeremiah, who said that the leaders of Israel were to become fisher people going into the community in the days of Jeremiah, where they had a twofold responsibility. One was to announce that God was coming in judgment over those who practiced idolatry, exploitation, and injustice, and to offer the way of repentance. This is number two, a way of repentance to cut yourself off from that life and to follow the ways of God away from judgment and towards salvation. By implication, that is the paradigm, the model, the way, the job description for the disciple of Jesus, announcing judgment and then pointing the way towards salvation by iterating those points and living in those ways I mentioned earlier, announcing that the realm of God is already beginning, offering it, embodying it, demonstrating it. And immediately they left their nets and followed him. We sometimes get hung up over this as if Jesus and Mark intended for those people in both generations, Jesus' generations and Mark's generations, and everyone to cut themselves off from what they're doing and to uproot and go after Jesus. I would say about this two things. Number one, it does assume a way of thinking that is not so characteristic today, but was commonplace then, which is that people could set off on missions, cutting themselves off from their bases, so to speak, and living on the hospitality, the housing, the food, the welcome of the people to whom they went. And they kind of assumed that if you were able to do that successfully, it was a sign that God, or the gods, if you were not Jewish or Christian, were smiling on your enterprise. But number two, by the time we get to the time of Mark, and certainly in our own time, we know that you can't cut yourself off in that way and be, well, in my judgment, and still be a responsible member of the community. But my teacher, Neil Hamilton, had a very interesting perspective on the nets and leaving and following Jesus. Through some historical study I won't reproduce here, he concludes that the nets are symbols of the old age, and that to follow Jesus is to leave the values and practices of the old age and to move toward the values and practices of the new age. This involves doing what Jesus said, and the disciples are missionaries, mission workers who follow in this tradition. Our West Street member, Linda Leininger, has made a t-shirt that I held up the other night and that I am wearing now that demonstrates this very thing. You have the old age with its characteristics and the new age toward which we are moving, and in the middle, we are living in the conflict zone, and Jesus makes his call to discipleship to those who are caught in the conflict between the old and the new, and their purpose is to point to the new within the conflict. In a certain way here, Jesus helps people respond to the emergency. When the world is collapsing all around you, when so much of what you have counted on is no longer right there, this gives you a direction, a hope. It gives you a flag behind which to march. At the same time, it creates a kind of emergency within the emergency, because it asks you if you are going to be content with continuing the world as it was, or in our case, going back to a fuller expression of the world as it was, or whether we are ready to join Jesus in the movement toward this world. Now, two things before I close. One is the reminder that the way of Jesus is the way of the disciple, so that what happens to Jesus also happens in a certain way to those who follow him. In Mark's case, Mark believed that those who followed Jesus would not only experience the power of the Spirit, the joy of teaching, the celebration of healing, restoration, and fellowship, but would also encounter conflict with those who resist those things, because they are so entrenched and they so profit from the old. So this is both an invitation and a pastoral warning. And the other thing is that we encounter the disciples here at the beginning in their positive fullness. Right here, they are models. This is what Jesus wants us to do, to leave our nets and follow him. But as the Gospel of Mark unfolds, the way Mark tells the story of the disciples, they are not so much models as anti-models. They are not so much exemplars as they are figures who don't quite get it and who are in the narrative in order to prompt us to ask whether or not we are getting it. But there is always, even when we do not get it, a theme introduced early in this gospel and ever implied, even when not explicit, that no matter how far we drift, there is always the possibility of repentance. There are always the arms waiting to welcome. There is always the Spirit already here, into which we need simply to plug the extension cords of our lives. Follow me, Jesus says. Follow me.